Okay, so the question is limit n tends to infinity sin n exist. This is true or false? Okay, so that if possible let limit n tends to infinity sin n exist. And limit n tends to infinity sin n that equal to a. Okay, so limit n tends to infinity sin n plus 2 also be a. Therefore, what we can say, limit n tends to infinity sin n plus 2 minus sin n that equal to limit n tends to infinity sin of n plus 2 minus limit n tends to infinity sin n that equal to a minus a. So this is 0. Okay, and here limit n tends to infinity sin n plus 2 minus sin n. So that is limit n tends to infinity 2 into cos n plus 2 plus n by 2 into sin of n plus 2 minus n by 2. So that is 0. So from here limit n tends to infinity cos of n plus 1 is 0. Since 2 into sin 1, here n minus n plus 2 by 2, so that is sin 1. And since 2 into sin 1 is finite, so limit n tends to infinity cos n plus 1 is 0. Okay, so we can say that limit n tends to infinity cos n also 0 and limit n tends to infinity cos of n plus 2 also 0. Okay, now limit n tends to infinity cos of n plus 2 minus cos of n, so that also be 0. Limit n tends to infinity cos n plus 2 minus cos n, it will be limit n tends to infinity cos n plus 2 minus limit n tends to infinity cos n. So 0 minus 0, that will be 0. Okay, so from here we can write limit n tends to infinity cos n plus 2 minus cos n, that is minus 2 sin of n plus 2 plus 2 by 2 into sin of n plus 2 minus n by 2 equal to 0. So from here what we get, limit of sin of n plus 1, this is sin n plus 2 plus n, sin of n plus 1 equal to 0 as minus 2 into sin 1, that is finite. So limit of sin n plus 1, that is 0. So from here what we get, limit of sin n also 0. Okay, so limit of sin n 0, so therefore limit of sin square n also 0. Okay, and here limit n tends to infinity cos n is 0, so limit n tends to infinity cos square n also 0. Okay, so here limit n tends to infinity sin square n is 0 and limit n tends to infinity cos square n is 0. So therefore by these two, what we get? We get limit n tends to infinity sin square n plus cos square n, that is 0, since both are 0. Again, we know sin square n plus cos square n, that equal to 1 for all n belongs to n. Okay, so from here if I take limit both side, so limit n tends to infinity, sin square n plus cos square n, so that will be also 1. Okay, so here we get one thing and here we get one thing, so we get a contradiction. So is a contradiction, therefore we arrived at a contradiction. So our assumption is wrong. So limit of sin n does not exist. Does not exist. So this is false.